Can be both ways. You can have before and after. Depends. One way, if you have before, it will guide your questions. If you have it after, the data will guide your theory. So it depends. I mean, if you haven't done your interview yet, but it can be both ways. Yeah. Okay, testing. Okay, everyone. I think the lecture started. So I have two kind of mini lectures today. The first is more substantial. It's focused on social factors and some almost purely social theories of SLA. It's not really looking at the more linguistic side of learning a language. It's looking at the social side, why people do it, how they do it. So I'm going to start with this now because I want to make sure that as many people as possible who will inevitably stream in will be able to look at the essay assessments brief that I'm going to give after this. So I'm just going to jump right into it. I wasn't sure if I'd be able to finish this, so I might need to stop early. Okay, so just to kind of set out the layout of the social within second language acquisition, there's various kind of purely social theories of SLA. One is a classic one from, I think, the late 1970s is acculturation theory. There's also the intergroup model, which is kind of closely related to it. There's a lot of similarities. There's language socialization, and maybe some of you who did first year Ling also would have learned about language socialization as like a paradigm for understanding how children learn language. It's also been applied to second language acquisition. You can see applied linguists can't resist the temptation of looking how first language acquisition takes place and then seeing where there are commonalities with second language learning. There's also what's called the ecological approach, in effect that viewing like an ecology or ecological system of all the elements, particularly the social or societal elements involved in second language acquisition. So maybe we'll get to look at that. Then there's something which focuses not so much on a theory, but more focusing on identity as the prism through which you would look at things like learning a language. So from a motivational perspective, where does identity come into play? From the perspective of being in a classroom where maybe you feel included or not included because of your identity, how does that come into play in terms of, learning outcomes, so and so. So we'll definitely look at some of the social identity theory. And there's a construct called investment, which kind of goes along with motivation, which we'll look at in relation to that. Then there's also various sociolinguistic factors which would be relevant to SLA. So for instance, just the fact of language contact, and there's a whole kind of subfield in sociolinguistics about language contact and all the implications when two language groups meet, and the various ways in which that can happen and the effects that can have on their respective languages. Language attitudes, we've looked at this a little bit in relation to motivation. It's probably much better placed in sociolinguistic factors because it's very seldom that individuals come up with their own attitudes unless they have a very strong opinion about something, which usually means they're intrinsically interested in it, right? Otherwise, you get your attitudes from the social world around you. It's passed on from your parents or from your peers. And then kind of in brackets and in very light gray, I've put a bunch of, you could also view these as like the language-related study, areas of study. So language policy and planning, often within sociolinguistics, you'd be looking at that. That has major implications for how second language acquisition takes place. Whatever the policy, say the family language policy, whatever the policy of your parents or your guardians, whatever policy they had, they didn't need to like have a conscious awareness of it, but what they enforced, as it were, in your home, wherever you grew up, that had major implications on how you learned your first language and potentially your second or third language, right? Similarly, then at the level of schools, educational language policy, at the level of nations and territories, so like South African government and all the policies that they have for I guess, our constitution says a whole bunch of things about how languages need to be used and how they need to be learned. So all of these things are kind of, I'm putting them under social factors. There's a lot of things that we could be looking at. I'm going to show you a few of the ones that are in bold, not any of the ones that come out of sociology of language, linguistic anthropology, language economics, language policy and planning. Those are all super interesting topics. And I mean, if you continue with Ling, I'd recommend having a look at some of those, particularly if you're within education, educational linguistics. These are also very relevant. Okay, so we're going to start with language attitudes because we've kind of already looked at it. I just also need to set a bit of a timer for myself quick. Okay, so I mean, there's lots of ways to describe what an attitude is, and effectively, there's just a bunch of synonyms, and they all mean the same thing. So beliefs, opinions, perspectives. And typically, there is a value judgment somewhere in there. It's not a very descriptive or purely factual thing like, oh, this language exists. That's just a statement of fact. That's not there's no kind of evaluation there. That's not an attitude. It's not an attitude to say something exists or something doesn't exist. But it's something like this thing is good or that thing is bad. That's kind of where attitudes matter. And so learners would manifest attitudes towards, obviously, the target language, the second language that they're learning, the speakers of that language, whoever they might be, the culture, if you can differentiate it from the people, then brought like within the context of where those people are and their language is used, whether that there's value to, whether it gives you social capital, right? Then also kind of attitudes about like its specific uses, its functions within your immediate circumstances or your not immediate circumstances. You might be learning something simply because it's useful in another place, not immediately here. And then also attitudes towards themselves as members of their own culture. And obviously cultures and people groups always kind of differentiate themselves in some ways. This is part of how we assert who we are, right, and our identities. So obviously identity and attitude often go together. All right, so, and I think it goes without saying that obviously attitudes impact motivation. Because motivation, I mean, if it's going to be strong, it's because there's all these things which almost dispose or orient you positively towards a certain like learning behavior. So if you have a whole bunch of negative attitudes, it's not going to dispose you well towards language learning. Okay, so just an example of this, and a former, I think, head of department of the linguistics department, Prof. Vivian de Klerk, she did some research in 2000, so a long time ago, 25 years, based, I think, looking at some schools here in Grahamstown, Makanda. Many IsiXhosa-speaking parents had and still have a negative attitude of education in the language, preferring their children to learn English. So there's a quote from her in italics. And so the attitude that these parents had was that English was, and almost certainly, I think there's been subsequent research to this effect, that English is still seen as essential for success. So there's a desire that, an attitude that like language, that English in particular is a language with prestige and maybe the language of the economy, et cetera, et cetera. It will give you access to opportunities. So it might not be like a language attitude that these parents could like consciously articulate, but there's an implicit attitude that they have towards both English and also in this context. Okay, so that's an example of, I guess, language attitudes. And you can see, I mean, obviously in this case, it's now parents who impact the ability of their children to learn certain languages because they're probably going to be in a circumstance where it's easier to pick up English, but then at the same time, that will obviously have impacts then on their ability to acquire their first language or their mother tongue. So, and so that's more the attitudes and the motivations of parents and guardians, but particularly when children and teenagers who usually have to go to school, they are so dependent on the motivations of other people. It's only really once you reach like the age of majority, 18, even then, sometimes you can't make your own decisions in life. Okay, so moving on to Norton's theory of social identity. Bonnie Norton, I think she was from South Africa originally. She's based in Canada now at the University of British Columbia. And in the early 90s, there was this thing going on in linguistics generally, maybe across the humanities and social sciences, but effectively it's called the social turn. Suddenly everyone was just like, we're sick of seeing humans as individuals, like brains in a vat, just kind of cognitive machines. They swung to the opposite end of the spectrum, where it's almost as if they didn't even see people as individuals, but they were very much products of their social environments. And I mean, this is issue with academia, and there's like these academic fashions. We swing from one direction to the other, and then irritatingly, people need to learn all sorts of very different theories. And she, within the context of that was happening broadly around her, she came up with this kind of theory of social identity. And her view was just that, language learners are not just a unitary construct. It's not just an individual, and all individuals are alike, but they are complex dynamic entities influenced by social structures and interactions. So she really focused then on social structures and interactions. And also then part of it, and she was coming out of, we needn't go deeply into it, but it's called like post-structuralist approach to, which comes out of, I guess, the structuralist paradigm, but it's very much focusing on, and it's kind of related to, I guess, postmodernism and even in her case, feminist theory. And it's interesting, yeah, so obviously it's a very, very different approach to something like what you're encountering in systemic functional linguistics, right? And her view was that power relations are a central kind of thing that you need to look at when you look at interactions, when you look at people's motivations, when you look at outcomes, right? And so her analysis then was that it's all good and well to say that people are motivated to learn a language, but sometimes they just can't be invested in doing it because of all sorts of reasons that have nothing to do internally with them, but everything to do with the social circumstances they find themselves in. So I think the next slide, I think that goes into it a bit further. So, motivation has been around for a long time as kind of a construct that's been looked at in SLA, but then investment in the mid-90s came along, and Norton tried to say, well, look, people can be motivated, but they don't necessarily feel invested if, for instance, they don't think that there's much reason for them to put time and energy into a language classroom where actually they are just being silenced all the time because, I don't know, the majority culture and all the people who are from that culture just find it really easy to speak because of the way that the teaching methodology works and all these various things. So she was particularly looking at kind of the development of literacy, but also classroom dynamics, looking at immigrants to the Canadian context and their experiences of learning and how they were positioned by first language speakers, which made them sometimes feel like silly or inferior. So she was looking at all of those kinds of factors and thinking, well, these are obviously very important when we are theorizing how second language acquisition works, and it impacts how people behave as they are learning, and then also the outcomes and whether they kind of remain invested in it as a long-term life project, right? Because if you feel as if this is belittling me, this is not going to get me any kind of social capital because people just have a certain view of me and I can't get out of it, like all sorts of questions like that, then you just might say, well, maybe I'm motivated to learn this language. I actually find it interesting, but I'm not invested in it. There's no social capital, economic capital that I can realize from learning this language. So she wanted to bring this kind of, she used an economic metaphor, obviously, of investment. Some people have critiqued her for that. Anyway, so this is kind of one, you could call it a theory. It's like a construct of investment, and it's related to her focus on social identity as being a crucial factor in the pursuit of learning a language. Okay, so, and just going a bit more into that. So language is not neutral in her view. It's a medium of social relations, right? So she's reducing ultimately language to social relations to ways in which we kind of communicate and assert ourselves in relation to other people. And that's, I guess, how she's viewing the learning process thing, because obviously everyone uses language to do things like that. Language is not always neutral. But she's now, well, moving away from the sociology of language to the sociology of language learning. That's maybe another way of looking at what she did. So learners either gain or denied access to powerful social networks through language. And some of the implications was that, well, in her view, SLA, up until that point, had not accounted for social structures and inequalities that shape learners' opportunities to learn language, right? To learn or use. And also part of it, and this is more relevant to the actual experience of learning a language, that certain interactions reproduce the broader social hierarchy. And I think in her view, and this is coming out of feminist thought and post-structuralist thought, is that research and then education in particular should be a way of helping to emancipate people who are being bound by certain inequitable social structures, right? So in helping them kind of achieve some kind of freedom from that. That's why she talks a lot about agency in her work. Yeah. Okay, so that was a snapshot of Norton's investment theory. I spent in my PhD, I took her theory, I kind of reworked it for my own purposes. So I found it quite interesting. I disagree also with a lot of it. I think it's very narrow and constrained, but I won't get into that topic. Okay. And now so how much time do I have until 9:20? Okay, I'm gonna look at this for 5 more minutes and then we're gonna move to the essay assessment. Okay, so there are some other theories of SLA and social context, which we didn't really spend much time on, but I just want to give you a snapshot of them as well. So the acculturation model by Schumann, his whole view was that language acquisition is purely almost a social phenomenon. It just depends on the social and psychological distance between the learner and the target language community. So if you are very distant socially, as in there's just the way that people do society in that group and in your group is just very different, as well as the way that you kind of think about the world, the way you behave, act, if that's also very different on average with people who speak a different language, that kind of integrating and crossing that gap, that boundary, is one of the things that kind of explains why people manage to do it or not. So yeah, greater integration, the ability. So if you're highly motivated with like an integrative motivation, for instance, that might actually be, and you can kind of see, maybe this was in the late 70s, Gardner and his socio-educational model, he was talking a lot about integrativeness. And the acculturation model was quite a big thing back in the day. So it's likely that there was some kind of conversation about integrating into a target language community. Yeah, so barriers like discrimination, low motivation, cultural isolation would hinder acquisition. So those are kind of the things that they focus on. You can see they're all very much social factors. A similar model of SLA, again, almost purely socially bounded. It's not looking at cognitive or psychological, well, it's looking at social psychological, but not individual psychological factors. It's influenced by group identity and social dynamics. So learners may resist or adopt a language based on their attitudes towards the dominant group. And you can see there's similarities between social identity theory with Norton here. He came up also, I'm not sure if he actually came up with the concept of ethno-linguistic identity, but his view was that if your own ethno-linguistic identity, so that's, I guess, the connection between the ethnos, your group, whether you would describe it as a race or culture or whatever, your ethnic identity, and then the linguistic identity. And those things almost always go together, not always. It's particularly with a language like English now, it's become so democratized across the world that arguably people can't really claim it as their own, as belonging to their ethnos. So if you have a very strong identity, like this is who we are, this is what we speak, this is how we speak, that can sometimes support or obstruct your language acquisition. Maybe have a lot of pride in your language and you'd almost refuse to learn other languages, particularly if you feel like you're being forced to. So that's one way in which this dynamic could work. However, also, if you feel as if your ethno-linguistic identity is very weak and you want something, you want to buffer and almost scaffold your own identity, you might seek out the identity in another ethno-linguistic group and then learn their language as a result of that. Okay, so those are kind of two theories, so the intergroup model and then the acculturation model. Then there's language socialization, specifically focused on second language socialization. And I mean, as the title suggests, it's focusing on socialization. It's more almost in the realm of sociology than it is in linguistics or language-related studies. It's looking at the dynamics of how socialization works and how, you are, then you're a member of a group and there's certain things that you want to achieve, for instance, in peer interactions, to be accepted, included, and language and learning the language of the group is maybe a way to then achieve those goals. So it's very much a means towards an end, a more social end, and that's where language learning comes in. So a lot of these also, because they're purely social theories and they're not really doing justice to the more purely linguistic side of things or the purely psychological side of things, they tend to reduce SLA down to, for instance, in this case, the motivations for learning are so that you can socialize well, which is like not the only reason that people do things, right? It's just so that you can socialize well. People also have their own intrinsic interests. People also have like goals and dreams that are maybe very different from what their broader social circles think. So it would be dangerous to take any of these theories and think that they can account for the whole of the phenomenon of second language acquisition. Okay, so just going to an example, one of the, I guess, ways of looking at what language socialization would be, a child, for first language socialization, is learning to speak with their family and they follow certain implicit rules. And I guess the language encodes those rules, whereas then an immigrant worker must actively learn both the language and the social norms of their new workplace. So it's very much weaving language plus the norms and the expectations and all the things that kind of the social context provide or don't provide. Okay, and then the final one that I'll look at in the last minute is the ecological approach. And I'm not really going to read anything from this. I'm going to go straight to some pictures. And this is drawing from, I think his name, I'm not sure which specific discipline he was in, but Bronfenbrenner or something like that. It's been a while. You might have encountered this somewhere else, Bronfenbrenner, yeah. And he had this, if you look at this like planetary almost looking diagram, he had this way of trying to specify how all the levels of social life interact with each other. So don't think of this as like a spatial diagram where as you go out, it's further away from you. So you could, the macro system that he's talking about doesn't necessarily just mean like the national government, and then the microsystem is the family. It's a bit more complex than that. For instance, in the mesosystem, which is the second ring from the center, so you have the individual, then you have the microsystem and the mesosystem. His view was that in the microsystem, you have all the kind of the immediate community factors. Maybe it's church or a religious institution or community that you're part of, health services, your peers, your school, your broader family. And then in the mesosystem, all of those various distinct community groups that influence you are interacting with each other. And those interactions produce new kind of implications for the individual. And then in the exosystem, then there are all the, I guess, what's happening outside of that that's not directly influencing the individual, but is indirectly influencing them. And then beyond that is the macro system, which is, let's say, the language policy of the country or the province, like what they're trying to, whether they're making certain languages official or not, whether they're investing in language teachers, all these kinds of things. Okay, so, and I was actually going to do this section at the end, so I'm going to move on to the other thing now, but there is no tutorial sheet for Friday, just so you know. Just bring printouts of all the essay, assignment related stuff on Are You Connected? I got an email from one person, I think, saying that they couldn't find the assignment brief. I'm pretty sure it is up there. Everyone else has managed to find it, right? Yeah, okay. So yeah, there'll be a quiz before the assignment workshop, just based on motivation lecture on Monday, and then the reading. So nothing that we did yesterday or today will be looked at.